My name is Dean Coleman. I am 54 years old. I have lived on County Road 7 in Shannon County, Missouri, my entire life, and I have walked that road in every season and at every hour since I was old enough to tie my own boots. I retired 3 years ago after 26 years running a crew for the County Roads Department, and if you want to know what kind of man I am, that is probably enough. I know grading and drainage and the kind of work that tears your hands up in cold weather and doesn't leave you with much patience for stories that can't be backed up by something you can put your hand on. I have heard the Ozark Ridge stories my whole life. Old men at the hardware store, cousins at deer camp, the kind of thing people tell around a fire when it gets late and someone's had enough to drink. I never gave any of it a moment's wait. I was not that kind of man. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you what happened on the evening of October 11th, 2019. Because the only thing I have left to give this account is the fact that I am not the kind of man who makes things up. I am telling it now because my wife Carla finally heard it last spring, and once I told her, something about carrying it alone lost its grip on me. She was the first person I told the whole thing to, start to finish, and she sat across the kitchen table without saying a word until I was done. Then she got up and poured us both a cup of coffee and said quietly that she believed me. That was all I needed. So if you've ever seen something out there yourself, leave a comment below, because it helps me understand that I am not the only one who has spent 5 years trying to fit one evening into a life that didn't have a place for it. I need to back up to what that walk was before I tell you what it became. Every evening that fall, weather permitting, I walked a 2-mile loop on County Road 7, out from my front porch, east toward the National Forest boundary, up past Walt Briggs's place and the old hay barn, then along the creek hollow and back. Hatch came with me every time. He was my blue tick hound, 7 years old that October, 58 pounds of hard muscle and calm temperament. He had treed bear in the Mark Twain and run coyote off my neighbor's fence line without any particular drama. He was not a dog that spooked easily. I want that on record. He was a working dog who had earned his keep and knew his territory and did not flinch at things other dogs would flinch at. I mention this because what he did that evening was so outside his character that I have never stopped accounting for it. That part of Shannon County sits right where the Ozark National Forest comes down off the ridges and meets the private ground along the road. The cedars on the east ridge are old and thick, some of them 30 feet high, and in October the light drops fast behind them and turns the hollow into a blue shadow well before full dark. The creek runs about 60 yards off the road through a stand of sycamore and river birch, and in fall it is low and cold and moves without much sound. Dusk along that hollow is one of the noisier times of day out there. Barred owls start up in the sycamores around 6 in the evening. Tree frogs go until hard frost. Crickets run later than you'd expect in October, sometimes past the middle of the month. I had walked that loop probably 300 times, and I knew the sounds, the way I knew the road surface, the way I knew where the soft shoulders were and which culverts needed clearing in spring. I knew it the way working men know the things they have tended. I left the porch at 6:15. The temperature was dropping toward 42 degrees, which I know because I had checked the thermometer on the porch rail before I put my coat on. I had my headlamp clipped to my jacket, but not switched on yet. Hatch was at my left heel, the way he always was. his nails clicking on the asphalt, his nose working the ditch grass. The light was still good at 6:15, that particular October light that makes everything look like it's been lacquered. The ridge was lit across the top and dark below the cedar line, and the sky behind it was going from orange to the color of old brass. It was a genuinely fine evening. I remember that specifically because of what came after. It was the kind of evening you want to hold still. I passed Walt's place at about the quarter-mile mark. His truck was in the drive, and a light was on in the kitchen. I didn't stop. Walt is in his mid-70s, and we have been neighbors for 30 years, without ever being the kind of neighbors who stop for long conversations. We wave, we talk at the co-op or the hardware store when we happen to meet, and that is the extent of it. I noticed the kitchen light and I kept walking. Hatch didn't slow down. The road was dry and the air smelled like dead leaves and the faint cold sweetness of water from the creek hollow. I reached the hay barn at the half-mile mark and turned east toward the creek hollow, which is where the road bends and the cedars on the ridge come closest to the road surface. The hollow is the lowest point of the loop, probably 50 feet below the ridge top, and in normal conditions the sound changes when you drop into it. The trees close up on both sides and the air gets cooler and the creek noise rises and the owls and frogs come at you from multiple directions. It is a layered sound, that hollow at dusk, and I had heard it so many times that it was nearly invisible to me, the way familiar sounds become invisible. You stop hearing them until they're gone. They were gone. I walked maybe 40 yards into the hollow before I understood that something was not right with the sound. There were no owls, no frogs, no crickets at all, which in the second week of October was wrong enough to notice. The creek was there, low and quiet, but the biological noise was simply absent, not subdued, not thin. Gone the way a room goes quiet when someone says something that stops every conversation at once. I stood there for a moment and listened, and the hollow gave me nothing but the water and the wind in the top of the cedars. My first explanation was weather-related. Sometimes a cold front pushing through will shut insects down, will change the behavior of the owls long enough to create a quiet stretch. I had seen it before. Not in October, not usually, but I told myself it was possible. Told myself the temperature had dropped a few more degrees than I'd expected, told myself it was nothing. Hatch was still walking, nose to the ground, along the ditch edge, apparently unbothered. Sight that reassured me. I kept moving. The second wrong thing happened 30 yards further in. Hatch stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped completely, both front feet planted, head up, nose forward, the full column of his neck rigid in a way I hadn't seen outside of a genuine threat stimulus. He was pointing east toward the ridge, not at any specific tree or shadow, but at the ridge itself, the whole face of it coming down through the cedars toward the road. His hackles were up from his shoulders to his tail, a full ridge of lifted fur that I could see even in the lowering light. He made no sound. That was the part that registered hardest. He did not growl. He did not bay. Hatch bayed at everything. It was what he was bred to do, and he was completely silent with his hackles at full height and his feet locked to the road, and I stopped beside him and I said quietly, "What is it, boy?" And he didn't move and didn't answer. I told myself it was a boar. There are wild hogs in those hollows, and a big boar upwind can make a dog lock up hard. I told myself it was a coyote. Maybe a pair of them work in the creek bank. maybe close enough to push Hatch's alertness past the normal threshold. I told myself it was a bear, and that was not impossible. Black bears had been expanding their range back into Shannon County, and a bear along the creek would explain the dog's behavior and the quiet of the hollow both. All of those explanations were available to me, and I tried on each of them, and each one fit loosely enough to be possible. And I stood there with my hand on Hatch's back, feeling the vibration of that locked up tension in his muscles. And none of the explanations quite settled. Then the smell came. It came from the ridge, from upslope, carried on the light downhill draft that runs along that hollow in the evenings. It was a heavy animal smell, which was not unusual in those woods, but underneath the animal smell was something else that I did not have a word for then and do not have a word for now. The closest I have come in 5 years of trying to name it is this. It was the smell of wet fur and scorched hair together. The way a campfire smells if something organic falls into it. That particular sharp and thick combination. It was not the smell of a coyote or a hog or a bear. I have been around all three at close range, and I know what they smell like. And this was none of those things. It was its own smell, particular and wrong, and it sat at the back of my throat and would not clear. Hatch still had not moved. I switched on my headlamp, though the light was not quite gone yet. The beam added detail to the shadows at the base of the cedar row without showing me anything I could identify. I scanned the ridge face and the road and the ditch on both sides, and I saw nothing. The smell was still there. Hatch's back was still rigid under my hand. I was deciding to turn back when I saw it on the ridge. It was a shape against the tree line, and what I registered first was the scale of it. Because the cedars on that ridge are reference objects I have used my entire life. I can tell you the height of any individual tree in that row to within a foot or two by eye, because I have looked at them from that road for decades, and they are as familiar to me as the dimensions of my own house. The shape I was looking at stood in the gap between two cedars I would put at about 22 feet, and it stood at approximately half their height, which put it somewhere between 10 and 12 feet tall. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. And I would have said the same thing about anyone who told me that before October of 2019. I am telling you what I saw against a reference I know, and the math does not change, regardless of what it implies. It was upright, standing on two legs, with the posture of a standing figure. Not a bear on its hind legs, not a tree that had come down at an angle and fooled my eyes in the low light. I have seen all of those things, and I have been fooled by all of them before, and this was none of those things. The silhouette was broad across the shoulders in a way that was wrong for a man and wrong for anything I could name, and it was still the way a standing figure goes still when it understands it has been seen, not frozen the way a deer goes frozen. Still in the way a person goes still when they are choosing what to do next. I did not run. I want to be precise about why. It was not courage. It was the understanding, somewhere below the level of thought, that running across that road in the near dark with whatever that was on the ridge behind me was likely the worst decision I could make. My legs had made that calculation before my mind caught up with it, and I was already taking a slow step backward, then another, keeping the headlamp beam in the direction of the ridge, keeping my eyes on that gap in the cedars. The shape did not move while I watched it. It stood in the gap, and it was there, and it was wrong, and the hollow was completely silent around it. Then the howl came. I have heard every sound these Ozark ridges make in 54 years. I have heard barred owls in full call, and they will raise the hair on your neck if you are not expecting them. I have heard coyotes in a pack along a creek bottom, 20 or 30 of them talking at once, and that sound fills your chest in a way that is hard to prepare for. I have heard a fox scream in the dark, which sounds close enough to a woman's voice that it has sent grown men off a porch to investigate. I have heard a bull elk bugle at close range, which is not a common sound in Shannon County, but which I encountered once years ago when a bull came south out of the Gasconade country, and I know what that sounds like. I have heard all of those things. What came off that ridge at approximately 6:45 in the evening of October 11th, 2019, was none of those things. It was a single long sound, one continuous note that started low and climbed. And the climbing was not the climbing of a coyote's yip sequence or the climb of an owl's territorial call. It was a climb that had architecture in it, a shape, a sustained deliberateness, and it rolled down the hollow and through the cedar row and across the road, and moved the air against my face when it passed. It lasted a long time, long enough that I counted the seconds without meaning to, and I counted to 8 before it fell off. And then the hollow received it and went back to its wrong silence. Every dog on that road answered, and not one of them answered with a bark. I heard it happen in sequence, from nearest to farthest. Walt's dog, a brown cur he kept in a kennel by the barn, let out a single yelp and went silent. Then the Hendersons' 2 labs, a quarter-mile east, set up a brief, frantic barking that cut off too fast. Then farther north, beyond the timber company road, I heard 2 or 3 dogs I didn't know well, brief and then nothing. And Hatch, who had not made a sound since we stopped, made a sound that I had never heard from him in 7 years. It was not a bark and not a growl. It was a low, compressed vocalization that came from somewhere deep in his chest. The kind of sound that means an animal has already made its decision and is communicating something final about its intentions. And then he turned and he ran past me, back toward the house, back toward the porch, and he was gone down the road. Before I'd finished turning my head to watch him, I was alone in the hollow. The headlamp beam reached about 30 feet in the fog that had started to settle off the creek, and past that the road was dark and the ridge was dark above the cedar line, and I could not see whether the shape was still in the gap between the trees. I did not shine the beam up there. I made a deliberate decision not to, and I cannot tell you exactly why, except that some part of me understood that confirming whether it was still there would not help me and might cost me something I could not afford to spend. I started backing down the road, not running, walking backward, slowly, keeping the light ahead of me, keeping my feet on the asphalt by feel, so I would not catch a heel on the shoulder gravel and go down. I watched the hollow close behind me as I moved, the tree line narrowing, the road bending back past the hay barn. My mouth was dry and my hands were at my sides, open, which is where I've always put them, when I need to think clearly, a habit from years of directing equipment operators, a physical habit of deliberateness. I kept walking backward. I was 60 yards from where Hatch had stopped when the sound came again, not the howl this time, a different sound, lower and closer. Something moving in the cedar row above me on the ridge face, the sound of weight on ground, of something descending the slope in the dark. It was not fast. It was methodical, the way something moves when it is not afraid of being heard. and I stopped walking and stood in the road and listened to it come down through the cedars. It came out of the trees and onto the road 60 yards ahead of me. The last of the daylight was still in the sky above the ridge, a gray residue of it, and it was enough. Not enough to give me detail, not enough to give me color, but enough to give me shape and mass and proportion. Enough to understand what I was looking at. It was standing in the road on 2 legs, and it was tall. Not the 12 feet I had estimated against the cedars, but tall in the way a man is tall relative to a road sign or a fence post. Tall in a way the body registers as wrong before the mind processes why. It was heavy across the chest and through the shoulders. The kind of mass that is not muscle alone but density itself. The whole form suggesting something that was substantial in a way I could feel across 60 yards of darkening road. The head was large and the ears were high on it, and the face was not a man's face. In that last gray light I could see that the face was long, elongated down from the brow, and what I saw in the area of the eyes was a faint reflection, a catch of whatever ambient light was still available. 2 points of flat pale light that were low on the face in a way that suggested the head was slightly down, slightly forward, the posture of something that is looking at you across a distance and deciding. The smell hit me then, full and direct, the wet fur and scorched hair smell, and it was thick enough that I could taste it. My headlamp was pointed at the road surface between us, and I did not raise it. I did not raise it for the same reason I had not shined it at the ridge. I was operating on a kind of instinct that I cannot fully explain even now, a sense that directing light at it was a form of provocation I could not afford. It did not move toward me. It stood in the road, and it was there, and I was there, and 60 yards of dark asphalt was between us, and the hollow was still silent, and the fog was settling in off the creek, and I was aware of my own breathing, short and controlled, and of my hands open at my sides. I thought, clearly and specifically, back up. I thought, do not turn around, I thought. The porch light is on, and the door is unlocked, and you know every inch of this road behind you. My body was already doing what my mind was confirming. I was moving backward at a slow walk, and the shape in the road did not follow me. It stood where it was. I put 1 foot behind the other and watched it across 60 yards, and it did not close the distance. I backed up for what I calculate was about 4 minutes. Long enough to reach the bend past the hay barn, long enough to lose the sight line to the hollow. When I came around that bend, I turned and walked fast, not running, to the far edge of the Henderson property, and then I ran. I ran the last quarter mile to my porch, and I went inside and I locked the door, which is something I have not done routinely in my entire life on that road. And I stood in the kitchen and I listened. Hatch was under the porch. I could hear him shifting in the gravel beneath my feet, that particular sound of a dog who has decided the underside of a structure is the appropriate place to be and has no plans to reconsider. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the light on, and I listened to the ridge and heard nothing out of the ordinary, which was its own kind of weight to carry. At some point after midnight, the owls started up in the sycamores. That was the first normal sound I had heard in hours, and it released something in my chest that I had been holding since the hollow. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the owls and did not move until first light. At first light, I went back. I do not know why. I have thought about it since, and the best I can say is that I needed the morning and the light to confirm what the dark had told me, or to refute it. I needed the road to be an ordinary road in the morning. I went back to where I had last seen the shape standing in the road, and the road was empty and the fog was gone, and the cedars on the ridge were dark and ordinary in the early flat light. I walked to the base of the ridge, to the soft muddy ground where the slope meets the road shoulder, and I found the impressions. There was one clear one and two partial ones in the mud along the shoulder where the ground holds moisture from the creek runoff. The clear one was deep. I have a size 11 boot, which is a larger foot than average, and I placed my boot beside it for reference, and the impression was longer than my foot by about 4 inches and wider by at least 2. It was not shaped like a boot print. The front of it showed 4 distinct pressure points that could have been toe pads arranged broadly, not the narrow toe box of a human print. The depth of it in that mud, given the soil's consistency after the week's rain, indicated a weight I did not want to estimate out loud. I stood over it for a minute or two, and then I went home. I did not tell Carla that morning. She was at her sister's place in Eminence, and she came back that afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch, and she asked if I had a good walk the night before, and I said, yes, fine, a little cold. She went inside and started dinner, and I sat on the porch in the afternoon sun, and I could see the cedar ridge from where I sat, and I did not say a word. I did not tell her for 6 months. I went to the store 3 days later, and I ran into Walt at the co-op, and I will tell you exactly what happened because it matters. I did not bring it up. I was in the hardware section looking at a box of 3-inch screws, and Walt came up the aisle, and we did the kind of brief nodding acknowledgement that 2 men who've been neighbors for 30 years do at the co-op. And I was about to move on, and Walt stopped and looked at me in a way that was slightly too considered for a greeting, and he said, "You walk your road that Friday evening?" I said I did. He looked at the shelf for a moment, not at me, and he said quietly, "That ridge has always had something on it." And then he moved on down the aisle, and that was the end of it. He did not look back, did not elaborate, did not offer anything else. He has never brought it up again in 5 years, and I have never asked him to. I do not think he would tell me more if I did. Some things that men who have lived on these ridges their whole lives will acknowledge in a single sentence are the most they will ever give you. And I think that one sentence was the most Walt Briggs has ever said about whatever lives up there. And I think it cost him something to say even that much. I stopped walking the 2-mile loop. I still go out in the evening sometimes, but I turn around at the half-mile mark, at the hay barn, before the road bends into the hollow. I have not gone past that bend at dusk since October of 2019. I have driven past it in the truck in the daytime and looked at the cedar ridge from behind glass, and that is as close as I have gotten to it. I put a motion-activated light on the side of the house that faces east. I check it when it triggers, and it is never triggered for anything other than deer and once a fox, and I still check it every time. Hatch died in November of 2021, 2 years after that evening. Old age and a bad hip that wore out faster than the rest of him. He was 9 years old, and he went in his sleep on the porch, which is the right way for a dog to go. I buried him in the back of the property under a red oak, and I put his collar on the nail by the back door where his leash had always hung, and I left it there. I do not know why I left it there. I did not make a conscious decision about it. It was just the place where things for Hatch had always been kept. And after he was gone, I kept keeping his collar there. and it has been on that nail for 3 years now. I did not tell Carla the full account until last April. 5.5 years of sitting with it. We were at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and she asked me something about why I'd stopped going past the barn on my walks. She'd noticed it finally, or maybe she had noticed it long before and chosen not to ask until that morning. I told her all of it, start to finish. The silence in the hollow, the smell, the shape on the ridge, the howl, the thing standing in the road in the last light, the impression in the mud the next morning. I told her about Walt at the co-op. I told her about the 6 months of carrying it alone. She sat across the table without saying a word until I was done, and then she got up and poured us both a cup of coffee. And she said, she believed me. She asked me once, quietly, if I thought it was still up there. I told her I didn't know. That was the honest answer. I don't know what it is, and I don't know if it has a permanent territory or if it passes through. And I have no plans to find out. What I know is what I saw. A competent man who has spent his adult life reading terrain and weather and equipment and the behavior of working animals, walking a road. He has walked 300 times with a dog that nothing frightened, in a hollow that is never quiet, on an ordinary October evening. Something on that ridge shut the hollow down. Something made the most reliable dog I have ever owned run past me and go under a porch and refuse to come out until morning. Something stood in my road in the last light of that evening and looked at me across 60 yards and did not come toward me when I walked backward, and I have been grateful for that specific detail every day since. I do not have a name for what it was. I do not have a category. I tried to find one for a while, the way a man tries to do, and eventually I stopped trying and started simply carrying it as a thing that happened, a thing that was real, a thing that I saw with my own 2 eyes on a specific road in Shannon County, Missouri on an October evening in 2019. Hatch's collar is still on the nail by the back door. Brown leather, a little dry now, with the brass ring where his lead used to clip. I see it every time I go out, every time I come in. I used to think I should take it down and put it away. I don't think that anymore. Some things you leave where they are,